The day everyone remembered it differently. It started with something so small that most people forgot about it within minutes. One ordinary afternoon, in a crowded city square, a man stepped into the middle of a passing crowd and said a single sentence. There was no stage, no microphone, and no reason for anyone to pay special attention. People were walking home from work, tourists were taking photos, and street vendors were packing up their stalls for the evening. The city moved the way it always did, busy, distracted, and indifferent. The man simply stood still, spoke a short sentence, and then walked away. The moment lasted less than 10 seconds. A few people nearby paused for a brief moment, more out of curiosity than concern. But nothing dramatic happened afterward. No one panicked. No one gathered around him. Within seconds, the flow of the crowd continued as if nothing unusual had occurred. If the story had ended there, it would have been forgotten completely. But later that evening, something strange began to happen. Someone posted a simple question online. Did anyone else hear that man speaking in the square today? At first, the replies seemed normal. A few people remembered the moment and said they had been nearby. But as more comments appeared, a strange pattern began to emerge. No one could agree on what the man had actually said. One person insisted that the man had shouted a warning. He said there was going to be an accident, they wrote. Another person quickly replied that this was wrong. He didn't warn anyone, he just asked what time it was. Then another comment appeared. That's not true, he said my name. Soon dozens of people joined the discussion. Many of them had clearly been present at the same moment in the same place, but every memory described something different. Some people remembered a warning about danger left. Others remembered a casual question. A few insisted the man had spoken directly to them, as if he somehow knew who they were. It made no sense. Eventually, someone managed to obtain security footage from a nearby building overlooking the square. The camera had captured the entire moment. The video showed the man stepping into the crowd. It showed him speaking. It showed a few people briefly pausing before continuing on their way. But there was one problem. The security camera had no audio. No one could hear the sentence he had spoken. For some people, this seemed like a simple explanation. Maybe the distance had distorted the sound. Maybe people had only heard fragments of the sentence and their minds filled in the rest. But one man who had also been in the square that day couldn't stop thinking about it. He couldn't remember the sentence either, only the strange feeling that something about the moment had felt wrong. So he downloaded the footage and watched it carefully. Once, then again, then a third time. On the third viewing, something strange happened. At first, he thought it was just a glitch in the video, but the more he replayed the moment, the more certain he became. Right after the man finished speaking, he slowly turned his head, not toward the crowd, not toward the street, but directly toward the security camera. The man in the footage looked straight into the lens, not by accident, not for a split second, but deliberately, as if he knew the camera was there, as if he knew someone would eventually watch the recording. The man paused for a moment, staring directly into the lens. Then the video continued normally. The crowd moved, people walked away, the moment ended. Confused, the viewer rewound the footage to watch the moment again. But this time, the man never turned his head. He simply spoke his sentence and walked away. The movement was gone. And to this day, no one has ever agreed on what the man actually said in the square that afternoon. The incident. The moment itself seemed completely ordinary. It happened in the late afternoon, at a time when the city square was always at its busiest. Office workers were beginning to leave their buildings after a long day. Tourists wandered between historic statues and fountains, taking photos in the fading sunlight. Street vendors were slowly packing up their carts, while musicians played soft melodies that blended into the noise of traffic nearby. It was the kind of place where thousands of small, forgettable moments happened every hour. No one expected anything unusual. The man appeared without attracting attention. No one could later agree on exactly where he had come from. Some people believed he had walked in from the street. Others thought he had been standing there already, unnoticed among the moving crowd. But at some point, He stepped into a small open space near the center of the square. He wasn't holding anything. No sign, no phone, no microphone. He didn't look like a performer or a protester. In fact, if someone had passed him on the sidewalk just a few minutes earlier, they probably wouldn't have remembered his face at all. He looked completely ordinary. The man stopped walking and stood still. For a brief moment, he seemed to study the people around him. The crowd flowed past in different directions, barely noticing him. Conversations continued. Footsteps echoed across the stone pavement. Then he spoke. It was not a shout, not loud enough to stop the entire square, just loud enough for the people nearby to hear a short sentence. Only a few words. Some people paused. A couple walking past slowed down for a moment. A woman carrying shopping bags briefly turned her head. A man standing near the fountain glanced over with mild curiosity. But there was no dramatic reaction. No one screamed. No one ran. No one gathered around him. Instead, something much stranger happened. People simply continued walking. The moment passed as quickly as it had begun. The man finished speaking, waited for a second or two, and then calmly walked away. No one followed him. No one tried to stop him. Within seconds, he disappeared back into the moving crowd that filled the square. Life returned to normal almost immediately. Tourists continued taking photos in front of the fountain. A group of teenagers laughed loudly as they crossed the plaza. A delivery cyclist rushed through the edge of the square, weaving between pedestrians. If someone had asked the people there 5 minutes later whether anything unusual had happened, most of them would have said no. Even the few who had heard the man's voice didn't seem particularly concerned. It had only been a sentence, just a stranger speaking in a public place. That kind of thing happened all the time. The city was full of voices, conversations, questions, and passing comments that blended together into a constant background noise. There was no reason to remember this one, and for the rest of the afternoon, no one did. The square slowly emptied as the evening approached. Office workers disappeared into subway stations. Tourists moved on to restaurants and hotels. Vendors packed their carts and rolled them down quiet side streets. By nightfall, the moment had already faded into the background of the day. A stranger had spoken a sentence. People had heard it. Then, everyone moved on. If the story had ended there, it would have remained just another invisible moment in the life of a busy city. But later that evening, when people began to remember what the man had said, that was when the real mystery began. The first reports. For several hours after the incident in the square, nothing unusual seemed to happen. The day continued the way it always did. People went home, ate dinner, scrolled through their phones, and forgot about most of the small moments they had experienced during the afternoon. The city outside moved into its nighttime rhythm, with traffic lights reflecting on wet pavement and the distant sound of sirens echoing between buildings. The man in the square should have become just another forgotten detail of the day. And for a while, he did. But sometime later that evening, a short post appeared online. It was written by someone who had been in the square that afternoon. The message itself was simple, almost casual, as if the person wasn't entirely sure whether the moment was worth mentioning. They wrote, "Did anyone else hear that guy speaking in the city square today?" At first, the post didn't attract much attention. A few people scrolled past it without thinking, but within minutes, someone replied, "Yeah, I was there. That was weird." Then another response appeared, "I heard him too." Soon more comments began appearing under the post. People who had been walking through the square at the same time slowly started to gather in the discussion. Many of them clearly remembered the same moment, a man standing in the middle of the crowd, speaking briefly before disappearing. At first, the conversation felt ordinary. People simply confirmed that they had seen the same thing. But then someone asked the obvious question, what did he actually say? The first answer appeared quickly. He warned everyone about an accident, one user wrote. Something about a crash or something bad about to happen. A few people reacted with confusion. "That's not what he said," another user replied. "He just asked what time it was." More responses began appearing. "No, that's not right either. He said something about someone being late." Then another comment appeared that changed the tone of the entire discussion. He said my name. At first, most people assumed the user was joking, but the replies kept coming. I swear he said my name, the person insisted. I even turned around because I thought he was talking directly to me. Another user responded almost immediately. Wait, he said my name too. The thread grew quickly. Dozens of people joined the conversation within an hour. Many of them had been present in the square at exactly the same time. But when they tried to recall what the man had said, their memories were completely different. Some people clearly remembered a warning. He said something like, "Be careful," or "Watch out," one person wrote. I remember thinking maybe there was a problem nearby. Others were equally certain that the sentence had been harmless. "I'm pretty sure he just asked a question," another comment said. Something like asking for the time or asking for directions. But a small number of replies described something far stranger. Several people claimed the man had spoken directly to them. One person insisted the man had called out their full name. Another said the sentence sounded like a personal message, something that only they would understand. A few described the strange feeling that the man had been looking directly at them while speaking. The more the discussion grew, the stranger it became. Some users began comparing their memories in detail, trying to piece together what had actually happened in the square. But every attempt only made the situation more confusing. The sentences people remembered weren't just slightly different, they were completely different. Warnings, questions, greetings, personal messages. The descriptions had almost nothing in common. At first, people assumed someone must be misremembering the moment. Human memory was imperfect, after all. It was easy to mix up words after several hours had passed. But the number of conflicting memories kept increasing. 20 people, 30. Eventually, more than 50 individuals claimed to have heard the man speak, and yet none of them could agree on what he had said. Some users began suggesting simple explanations. Maybe the man had spoken quietly and people had only heard fragments of the sentence. Maybe the noise of the square had distorted the words. Maybe people were accidentally filling in the missing details with their own assumptions. But even those explanations didn't fully solve the problem. Because the memories weren't just slightly inaccurate, they were entirely different sentences. Eventually, someone in the discussion asked a question that shifted the entire conversation in a new direction. If this many people were there, they wrote, then there has to be security footage. The city square was surrounded by buildings, shops, and offices. Cameras were everywhere. Street surveillance systems monitored traffic, storefronts had security cameras facing the sidewalks, and nearby office towers often recorded wide views of the plaza below. If the moment had really happened the way everyone described, then somewhere there had to be a recording of it. And if there was video, then the mystery could finally be solved. All they needed to do was find the footage. Because if the camera had captured the moment, then it would finally reveal what the man had actually said. The security footage. Once the idea of security footage was mentioned, the entire discussion shifted. What had started as a strange online conversation about conflicting memories suddenly became something more serious. If cameras had recorded the moment in the square, then the mystery could finally be resolved. Someone would simply watch the video, and the truth would be obvious. Several users began searching for possible camera angles around the city square. The area was surrounded by office buildings, restaurants, retail stores, and public transit entrances. Nearly every corner of the plaza was monitored by some kind of security system. It didn't take long for someone to find a possible source. A mid-sized office building on the north side of the square had a security camera mounted above its entrance. The camera faced outward, angled slightly downward toward the plaza below. From that position, it captured a wide view of the area where the man had reportedly been standing. One of the users in the discussion claimed to work in the building. At first, they hesitated to share anything. Security footage usually wasn't meant for public viewing, and accessing it without permission could create problems. But curiosity slowly overcame caution. The conversation online had grown too strange to ignore, so later that night, the user returned with a short message: "I found the footage." Within seconds, the thread exploded with replies. People asked for proof. Some doubted the claim entirely. Others simply demanded to see the video immediately. A few minutes later, a short clip was uploaded. It wasn't long, only about 15 seconds. The quality wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough to see what was happening in the square. And there he was, the man. The camera captured him walking into the open space near the center of the plaza. People moved around him in every direction. A couple crossed the square in front of him, while a small group stood near the fountain in the background. The scene looked exactly the way several witnesses had described it. Nothing dramatic, just an ordinary afternoon in a busy public space. The man stopped walking. He turned slightly, facing the crowd passing through the square. Then, according to the timestamps on the video, something happened. His mouth moved, he spoke. A few nearby pedestrians paused briefly, just as people online had claimed. One person turned their head. Another slowed down for a moment before continuing forward. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the man turned and walked away. He disappeared into the moving crowd within seconds. The clip ended. At first, viewers were confused. Something was missing. Then someone noticed the problem. There's no sound. The camera had recorded video only. No audio. The entire clip was silent. You could see the man speak, but you couldn't hear a single word he said. At first, this seemed like a disappointing coincidence. But the more people watched the video, the stranger it became. The footage confirmed several important details. The man had definitely spoken. He had stood in the exact location people described. Nearby pedestrians had reacted slightly, just as the witnesses had said. But the video could not answer the most important question. What sentence had he spoken? Without audio, the mystery remained unsolved. Some viewers tried to study the man's lips, attempting to read the sentence by watching the movement of his mouth. A few people slowed the video down frame by frame, analyzing each second carefully. But lip reading from security footage proved nearly impossible. The camera angle was too far away. The resolution wasn't sharp enough to capture precise mouth movements. Even when the video was paused at the exact moment he spoke, the words remained impossible to identify. The discussion online continued growing. Some users became even more convinced of their original memories. "See," one person wrote, "look at the way people turn their heads. That's exactly when he gave the warning." Others disagreed immediately. "No, that's when he asked the question." Another comment appeared below it. "He's clearly talking to someone specific. Look where he's looking." The video didn't solve the argument. If anything, it made the disagreement worse. Now people had a visual reference point for the moment, but the missing audio allowed their interpretations to continue. Everyone saw the same image, but everyone imagined a different sentence. For most viewers, the clip remained nothing more than an interesting mystery, but one person watching the video felt something different. A man who had also been in the square that afternoon. Unlike the others, he didn't focus on the missing audio. Instead, he focused on the man himself, the way he stood, the way he moved, and the strange feeling that something about the moment wasn't quite right. The man downloaded the video to his computer. At first, he told himself he was just curious, but curiosity slowly turned into obsession. He watched the clip several times that night. Then he watched it again the next morning. He slowed the footage down, studying every second of the recording. The crowd, the timing, the reactions of people nearby. Everything seemed completely normal. Until the third time he replayed the clip, because during that viewing, something inside the video changed. The investigation. For most people, the mystery of the man in the square slowly faded after the footage was posted. The discussion thread remained active for a few days. People continued arguing about what they remembered hearing. Some insisted their memory was clear. Others admitted they were no longer sure. A few new viewers joined the conversation simply because the story sounded strange enough to be interesting. But eventually, like most things on the internet, the conversation began to slow down. New topics replaced it. New distractions appeared. The man in the square became just another unsolved curiosity buried beneath thousands of newer posts. For almost everyone, the mystery ended there. But not for one person. The man who had downloaded the security footage could not stop thinking about it. At first, he told himself it was just curiosity. The conflicting memories were unusual, but not impossible. Human memory was unreliable, especially in crowded public places. Psychologists had documented countless examples of people remembering the same event differently. That explanation should have been enough. But something about the footage bothered him. It wasn't just the missing audio. It was the feeling that something in the moment itself was wrong. He had been in the square that afternoon too. He clearly remembered hearing the man speak. Yet when he tried to recall the sentence, his mind felt strangely empty. There was no sentence, no clear memory of words, just the vague awareness that something had been said. And the more he thought about it, the more unsettling that feeling became. So he decided to examine the footage more carefully. He opened the video file again on his computer and began watching it frame by frame. At first, he focused on the obvious details. The man's clothing, a dark jacket, plain pants, nothing distinctive. His posture, relaxed, calm, almost casual. The people nearby, a couple walking past him, a woman carrying shopping bags, a man standing beside the fountain. None of them reacted dramatically. Their movements seemed normal, but he kept watching, again and again. Each time he replayed the footage, he noticed small details he had missed before. The timing of the man stepping into the open space, the way a few pedestrians briefly slowed their pace when the man began to speak. It all matched what the witnesses had described online. Still, nothing seemed truly unusual. The man stepped forward. He spoke. People paused for a moment. Then they continued walking. A simple moment in a busy city. But the viewer couldn't shake the feeling that he had overlooked something important. So he began slowing the video down. Half speed, then quarter speed. Each movement stretched into slow, deliberate motion. The crowd flowing through the square looked almost like a silent river of people drifting past the stationary figure in the center. The man watched carefully as the stranger prepared to speak. The moment was subtle. The man shifted his weight slightly. His shoulders moved. His mouth opened. Then he spoke. Without sound, the action felt strangely unnatural. The words existed only as silent movements of the lips. A few people nearby reacted slightly. One person turned their head. Another slowed down for a second. Then everything continued normally. The stranger finished speaking and turned to leave. The clip ended. The viewer leaned back in his chair. He had now watched the footage more than 10 times. Still nothing. No hidden detail. No obvious explanation. Just the same short, silent moment repeating again and again. He closed the video player and tried to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. But later that night, the thought returned. So he opened the file again. This time, he focused on the man's face. He zoomed in as much as the video resolution allowed. The image became slightly grainy, but the man's movements were still visible. Again, the footage began. The man stepped forward. He spoke. The nearby pedestrians paused. Then the man began to turn away. That was when the viewer noticed something, a movement so small he had missed it before. At first, he assumed it was just a minor shift in the man's posture. But the more he replayed the moment, the more obvious it became. After speaking, the man didn't immediately walk away. Instead, he hesitated for less than a second. Then his head began to turn, slowly, not toward the crowd, not toward the people who had paused nearby, but toward something else. The viewer leaned closer to the screen. The camera, the man in the footage, was turning his head directly toward the security camera mounted on the building. At first, the movement was subtle, almost natural, but then the man's face aligned perfectly with the lens, and for a brief moment, he appeared to be looking straight into it. The viewer felt a sudden chill. That didn't make sense. The camera was mounted high above the square, several stories up on the building wall. From the ground, it would have been difficult to notice, especially for someone standing in the middle of the crowd. Yet the man's gaze seemed precise, intentional, as if he knew exactly where the camera was. The viewer replayed the clip again and again. Each time, the moment looked the same. The man spoke, paused, turned his head, and looked directly at the camera. The viewer sat back slowly, trying to understand what he had just seen. It was probably nothing. Maybe the man had simply glanced upward. Maybe it was coincidence. But something about the timing felt wrong. The movement happened at the exact moment the man finished speaking, almost as if the sentence itself had been directed not just at the crowd, but at whoever might eventually watch the recording. The viewer rewound the video again, preparing to confirm what he had just seen. But when the clip started this time, something was different. The man spoke, then immediately turned and walked away. No pause, no upward glance, no movement toward the camera. The moment had vanished, and suddenly, the viewer realized something deeply unsettling. The movement he had just watched several times was no longer in the footage. The glitch. At first, he assumed he had made a mistake. The human brain was unreliable, especially after hours of staring at the same piece of footage. It was easy to imagine small movements that weren't actually there. Fatigue could play tricks on perception, creating details that only existed in memory. So he told himself that was the explanation. He had simply misseen something. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. Just a few minutes earlier, he had watched the moment clearly. The man in the square had paused after speaking, turned his head upward, and looked directly into the security camera. He was certain of it. The movement had been subtle but unmistakable. But now, when the video replayed, the moment was gone. The man spoke. Then he turned and walked away. Nothing more. No hesitation, no glance, no eye contact with the camera. The viewer leaned forward and replayed the clip again. The same result. He tried slowing the footage down. Half speed, then quarter speed. Each frame stretched across the screen as the stranger stepped forward into the open space of the square. The crowd moved past him in a steady rhythm, unaware of the moment that was about to happen. The man opened his mouth. He spoke the silent sentence. Nearby pedestrians briefly reacted. Then he turned and left. The clip ended. The viewer stared at the screen. His memory insisted the movement had been there, but the video no longer showed it. For several minutes, he simply sat in silence, replaying the footage again and again. Each time he reached the moment where the man should have paused, he watched carefully for any sign of the head turning toward the camera. Nothing. The stranger's actions were smooth and simple now. Step forward, speak, walk away. That was all. The viewer rubbed his eyes and leaned back in his chair. Maybe he had imagined it. After all, he had already watched the video dozens of times. It was possible that his mind had simply inserted a small detail where none existed. The brain often tried to fill gaps in incomplete information, especially when something felt mysterious. He tried to convince himself that this explanation made sense, but something still bothered him. If he had imagined the movement, why did the memory feel so clear? He remembered the exact moment when the man's face aligned with the camera. He remembered the brief pause, the unsettling feeling that the stranger had been looking directly at whoever would eventually watch the recording. It hadn't felt like imagination. It had felt real. The viewer leaned forward again and reopened the editing controls on the video player. This time, he advanced the clip frame by frame. Each tap of the keyboard moved the video forward by a fraction of a second. Frame, frame, frame. The man stepping forward. Frame, his shoulders shifting. Frame, his mouth opening. Frame, the silent sentence being spoken. Frame, the pedestrian slowing down. Frame, then the moment where he had previously seen the pause. The viewer froze. For a split second, something strange appeared. It wasn't the full movement he remembered, but it was close. The man's head shifted slightly upward, barely noticeable. Just a fraction of motion. Then in the very next frame, the movement was gone. The man's body turned away and continued walking. The viewer quickly moved the video backward, frame by frame again. When he returned to the same moment, the tiny upward motion had vanished. Now the man's head remained perfectly still. The viewer felt a chill run through him. He tried the sequence again, forward, backward. Each time, the frame seemed slightly different. Sometimes the head movement appeared. Sometimes it didn't. It was so subtle that anyone watching at normal speed would never notice it. But now that he had seen it once, he couldn't ignore the possibility that something in the footage wasn't behaving normally. Digital video files weren't supposed to change. Once recorded, every frame remained exactly the same each time it was played. But this clip felt unstable. almost as if the moment itself refused to stay consistent. The viewer leaned closer to the screen, his eyes focused on the stranger's face in the center of the square. For a moment, nothing unusual happened. Then, during one playback, the movement returned, clearer this time. The man finished speaking, paused, and slowly turned his head upward. His face aligned perfectly with the direction of the camera. For a brief moment, his eyes seemed to meet the lens directly. The viewer's heart skipped. There it was, exactly the way he remembered it. The stranger was looking straight at the camera, looking straight at him. The viewer quickly rewound the clip to confirm what he had just seen. But when the video replayed again, the man never turned his head. The final twist. For a long moment, he didn't move. The room around him was completely silent, except for the quiet hum of his computer. The paused video frame glowed faintly on the monitor, frozen at the exact moment the man stood in the middle of the square. Just another ordinary figure among dozens of passing strangers. But now the viewer knew something about that moment wasn't stable. He had seen the head turn, more than once. And yet every time he tried to confirm it, the movement disappeared again. He leaned forward and pressed play. The clip started from the beginning. The man walked into the open space. The crowd flowed around him like water around a stone. He spoke the silent sentence. A few nearby pedestrians paused. Then the man turned and walked away. Nothing unusual. The viewer exhaled slowly. Maybe he had imagined the whole thing. Maybe fatigue had distorted his perception. Maybe the brain had simply created a memory that never existed. But before he could close the video, a thought occurred to him. He dragged the timeline marker back to the exact moment the stranger finished speaking. Then he slowed the playback speed to the lowest setting. Frame by frame, the scene began to unfold again. The stranger's mouth closed. The nearby pedestrians began to move again. Then the stranger paused. It was only for an instant, but it was enough. His head began to move. The viewer felt his chest tighten. The movement was slow, deliberate. The stranger's face turned upward, higher, higher, until it aligned perfectly with the camera mounted on the building wall. The stranger was looking directly into the lens. Not briefly, not by coincidence. He held the gaze for nearly 2 full seconds. The viewer felt an uncomfortable sensation crawl up the back of his neck. Because there was something about the expression on the stranger's face that made the moment even more unsettling. He wasn't confused. He wasn't curious. He looked aware, almost calm, as if this exact moment had been expected, as if he knew someone would eventually be sitting in front of a screen, watching the footage again and again, trying to understand what had happened in the square that afternoon. The viewer instinctively paused the video. The image froze. The stranger's face remained fixed on the screen, eyes directed straight into the camera, straight toward whoever was watching. The viewer stared at the frame for several seconds. Then he rewound the video again. If the movement appeared this clearly once, it should appear again. The timeline slid backward to the moment before the head turned. He pressed play. The scene unfolded. The stranger stepped forward. He spoke. Then he turned and walked away. No pause, no head movement, no eye contact. The viewer felt his pulse quicken. He rewound the clip again. Same result. The stranger never looked at the camera. He tried once more. Again, the moment was gone. Now the footage looked perfectly normal. The viewer leaned back slowly. The only proof that the movement had ever happened was his own memory. And suddenly, a much darker possibility entered his mind. What if the footage hadn't changed? What if his memory had? He opened the discussion thread where people had been arguing about the sentence spoken in the square. Dozens of comments were still there, people insisting they clearly remembered what the man had said. A warning, a question, a greeting, a name. Everyone remembered something different, and now the viewer realized something disturbing. He had spent hours studying the video, watching it over and over again, trying to uncover the truth. But during all that time, he had never once asked himself a simple question. What had the man actually said? The viewer closed the video player and sat quietly in front of the darkened screen. He searched his mind for the memory, for the sentence he had heard in the square that afternoon. But just like everyone else, he couldn't remember it anymore. Closing question. In the end, the mystery of the man in the square was never solved. The discussion online slowly faded, just like so many strange stories that appear briefly on the internet before disappearing beneath newer ones. People stopped commenting. The thread became inactive. Eventually, it was buried deep within the endless archive of old conversations. But the question never truly went away. What had the man actually said that afternoon? Dozens of people had been standing in the square when the moment happened. They had all heard the same voice, spoken at the same time, in the same place. Yet every memory told a different story. Some people were certain the man had warned them about an accident. They remembered a tone of urgency, something that sounded like a caution or a warning. A few insisted that the words had made them briefly uneasy, as if the man had been trying to alert the crowd to something that had not yet happened. Others remembered something far less dramatic. To them, the sentence had sounded like a simple question, something ordinary, like asking for the time or asking for directions, the kind of thing strangers say to each other in a busy city every day. And then there were the few memories that didn't fit either explanation. People who claimed the man had spoken directly to them. One person remembered hearing their name. Another described the strange feeling that the sentence had been meant specifically for them, as if the man had been addressing them personally, even though they had never met before. The more these memories were compared, the more impossible the situation became. It wasn't just that people disagreed. It was that their memories described entirely different sentences, warnings, questions, personal messages, all spoken during the same brief moment. The security footage never provided an answer. Without audio, the recording only confirmed what everyone already knew. The man had spoken, and a few people nearby had briefly reacted. But the most important detail, the words themselves, remained missing. And without those words, the truth could never be fully reconstructed. Some people eventually suggested psychological explanations. Human memory was fragile. In crowded environments, people often misheard words or interpreted them differently. Over time, those imperfect memories could shift even further as people tried to recall the moment. Perhaps that was all this was. A simple misunderstanding multiplied by dozens of people trying to remember the same event. But there was one detail that continued to bother the man who had studied the footage. The moment when the stranger had turned toward the camera, or at least, the moment he thought he had seen. Even now, he wasn't completely certain it had actually happened. Every time he replayed the clip afterward, the stranger simply spoke and walked away. Nothing more. The movement was gone, just like the sentence. And sometimes late at night, the viewer found himself thinking about a possibility that felt far more unsettling than a simple mistake. What if the problem had never been the video? What if the video had always been correct? What if the only thing that had changed was the memory of the people who heard the sentence? Because if that were true, then perhaps the man in the square had never spoken one message to the entire crowd. Maybe he had spoken something different, something specific, something that each person heard in their own way, a message that existed only inside their minds. Which leaves one final question. If everyone remembers hearing something different, what was the sentence that was actually spoken?
Shadows grow where the light won't go. A silent wind, it starts to grow.